Okay, so I'm going to use this short screencast demonstration to work through the initial processes following the establishment of the projection cameras. So we've established, for example, that we've got, this is obviously the shot camera here, which is some arbitrary frame. We know that we're going to be projecting our primary shot from this, which is the primary static projection camera. And what I would be doing is I would be starting to construct my entire map painting, or as much as we can see from this particular angle, because obviously if I just go back to this camera and we just advance, there are areas around the corner here that we don't see initially. There's additional buildings here that are going to be added in later. There's obviously this facade that we don't see. There's this close area on this right hand side building. So there's stuff that we don't see at the beginning of the shot. If I just jump back to my main primary shot, there's stuff that we don't see here, but I would still be basing and building the majority of my map painting certainly in this area. Maybe not too concerned about the right hand building, because I've already established I'm going to be creating a separate projection system for that. But certainly this sort of main area here, this is where I would construct an entire map painting. What I want to go through prior to that, and this is the purpose of this screencast, is to go through the process of actually outputting some renders from the 3D system, which is going to help me to construct the map painting. So I'm going to basically output some passes. And I'm going to work through a couple of the ways to go about that. Okay, so the first thing is to come into the render settings and enable multipass, and you can see that I've already loaded in some passes here, which I'll just select those and take them out so that I can put them back in again. So again, starting from scratch, I'll be enabling the multipass. I'll turn that off as well so that I can explain that a little bit later on. I'd be enabling the multipass, and then I'd be choosing specific passes from the menu. So I'd be wanting, for example, I'd be wanting a Specular Pass, which is going to give me some of the sort of the vision areas of light. I'm going to be wanting my diffuse, which is basically the scene illumination but without lights. So basically lit from the viewport. I'm going to be wanting a depth pass, so which is down here. It's off the screen capture, unfortunately, but you'll see it appearing here. A depth pass, and I'm going to be wanting an ambient occlusion pass, which is just here. And normally, when you enable the ambient occlusion, normally you have to turn it on down here in order to basically control it and create some parameters by which the ambient occlusion will be projected. Okay, so I've created myself some passes there to output. Okay, the next thing that I'll be doing is I'll be turning on the lights, and the real cool thing about Cinema 4D is it gives you the opportunity to, if I just set that to all, it's basically going to create me a pass for each of the lights that I've got in my scene. And I can actually go further than this. I can actually break it down into separate channels, so I can actually extract the diffuse, the specular and the shadow information from each of the lights. I don't really need to do that in this particular case, so I'm actually going to bake those all together. But by choosing separate lights, what it's essentially going to do is it's going to give me the lighting information of the scene cast from the light that I've got up here and the light that I've got from this second lamppost around the corner, and also a light that I've got up here sort of projecting out from this sort of town hall building, which we're imagining to be in this area. So we've got three lights output in there. I think the rest of the lights I'm actually going to in the scene I'm going to create through painterly effects, but I am actually going to sort of create some scene illumination using those lights. So going back to my renders, this is pretty much a render setup which I can use to generate some passes. Okay, I am actually just going to quickly go through a process whereby I can actually create myself a material ID. And what a material ID, it's basically going to create me it's going to sort of separate out all the objects within this scene and give them their own unique colour. And the advantage of that is I can basically pick those colours in the composite, and I can use those colours to create masks, so I can do specific operations on specific things without having to draw roto shapes around everything. And I'm going to go through the process of how we actually create that now. I'll just come into it and just check my my anti-aliasing, which is currently set to best, which is what it should be, and that gives kind of dithered edges around the sort of boundaries of the image there, which is the correct way that that 3D should be represented when it's turned into imagery. Okay, but what I want to do is I just want to show how to create a custom material ID. I'll scrap those because I've already done this, so I'm just going to go through this process again. And we can see that this is all the geometry in the scene. So I'm going to go through. I don't want the background and the backdrop. These are sort of in the far distance, and I'm going to be actually approaching that using a separate model. So I'm just going to select everything from the that's sort of immediately within the scene. Okay, and then I'm going to come into the tags, Cinema 4D tags. This is kind of slightly going off screen, and choose compositing. And you can see that that puts these compositing tags into the scene. Okay. And if I just scroll down here, you can see that we can use these to create a matte object, which basically means now that that we can start to assign specific colours to specific to each of these particular tags, basically by selecting one, like so, the first one, and then maybe choosing an arbitrary colour. Let's go for a swatch, so I could choose an arbitrary colour like that. And what that means is that Cinema 4D will render me a specific pass just with that colour for, in this particular case, building 1, which is that building there. That would be distinguished from, say, for example, the pillar and the steps, which may intersect obviously as the camera goes across, which would be assigned completely different colours. Okay, but I'm actually going to automate this process, so I'm not actually going to use that sort of manual method of I'll just put a tag on that one that I've just deleted, so I can start this from scratch. And I'll just pull this up so we've got a little bit more of this space. So what I would do then is I would select all of these objects so that they're all highlighted, and then enable those. Okay. The next thing that I would want to do is I'd want to get all the subcolors. So to do that, I come into user interface and choose show subchannels, and that opens up these. So if I just demonstrate that just by turning them off, you'll see that the RGB, the separate red, green, blue channels disappear. So we come into this and we choose the user interface, and then we show the subchannels, and now we can get at the separate red, green and blue channels separately. Okay. So the next thing that we do is we want to kind of create a random a randomness inside these, so that we get different values inside each. So every time it creates a tag, of which there are probably about a dozen there, it's going to put going to create a completely random colour and assign that to that particular tag. So I'll end up with sort of a bit of a multicoloured sort of patchwork scenario here, which is fine because this is not a pass that we ever see. This is a functional pass that we use later on in the composite. So to do that, I'm just going to add a slight expression. Okay, so don't ask me to explain this, but essentially what I'm doing is creating a variable which I'm calling x, and then I'm assigning a random operator using the RND, and then what I'm saying is choose any value in the brackets, any value between 0 and 100%. Okay, so I accept that. And that has assigned that expression, but currently only in the red channel. So I'll just repeat that. So x plus my random operator, and then I'm telling it to choose a random colour, anything between 0% and 100%. And I'm just going to copy that so that I don't have to type it again, and then I'll just paste it into the blue channel. So essentially what I've got now is I've got it. It should assign a completely different colour to each of these tags. Okay, so we'll render it out and we'll have a look at how that sort of works. But before I do that, I need to come into the render settings, and I need to turn off anti-aliasing. That's important because we don't want any any dithering of the edges on this, because this is actually going to generate mattes, alphas, masks essentially. And so we don't want any fall off around the edges caused by dithering, which is a consequence of anti-aliasing. So if I just come back into this now and just turn off my multipass temporarily, and I'll just enable my regular image, and then we will output that, and you can see what it does. You can see that it renders, and it's rendering me this pattern formation whereby it's assigning a separate colour to each of the tags, and of course there's a tag on each piece of geometry in my scene. So this is just a way of automating this process, so you don't actually have to go through each one of the tags manually assigning a colour, which would be time consuming, and also there is a potential for you choosing an identical colour, which would therefore create a problem. So in this particular case, this is automating that process. It's using random operators. The chance of it creating a duplicate colour are virtually nil, and I'll just flip over into Photoshop. So assuming that all that has been done, this is kind of like what the scene would look like. So this is a depth pass. I'll just zoom out a little bit so we can see these passes individually. This is a depth pass. So what this is doing, this again was one of the passes that I created in Cinema 4D. This basically assigns brightness values based on the proximity of each pixel to camera. And what that's going to allow me to do in the composite is do depth of field effects, and maybe atmospheric effects like fog. That's certainly one of the things I want to get into my matte painting, is some feeling of sort of ground mist or maybe fog, not so dense that you can't actually see through, but enough to kind of occlude your vision as you look down that street. And the depth pass here gives me that value. So it allows me to actually, in the composite, use this pixel data, working on the basis that the closer to the camera, the brighter the pixels get, the further away from the camera, the darker the pixels get. I can use that information in the composite and apply that to things like fog and mist, and therefore get the fog to be of different density at different areas based on the proximity of each pixel to camera. Okay, so that's what the depth is going to give me. Okay, then we've got our diffuse pass, which is just basically the scene geometry with flat lighting assigned. I've then got a specular pass, which is applied additively, and the good thing about Cinema 4D, I should mention this, is that when we actually create the setup of the multipass, which I'm going to need to turn back on, and also turn the anti-aliasing back on, when we create the multipass setup, we can tell it to create a multi-layer file, and you can see I'm using the PSD, which is the Photoshop extension. So what that is essentially doing is creating this file. So this layered file there, where it's taking all the passes from the render, and it's assigning those into their own layer. Okay, so there are our specular values. So it's applied, and again, as I mentioned, the good thing is that it applies them with the blend operation. You can see the linear dodge, which is an additive mode. It's assigning that value so that so basically only if I just isolate this layer and just turn the opacity up. Essentially what it's doing is it's discarding any information that's black, it's retaining 100% of the information that's white, and then it's retaining a percentage of the brightness values based on how bright they are. So the closer to white, the more of that information is retained, and the closer to black, the less of that information is retained. So it basically sets transparency values based on that sort of equation. Okay, so that's what the linear dodge does. So, but you can see that with that on, it's far too bright. So I've just brought the opacity of that right down, sort of into this low value. So it's giving me some specularity, but we wouldn't expect to see a great deal of specularity on masonry. So now we're getting into our lights. Now there's no point showing light 3 because that's the one that's round the corner. We never see that from this particular camera angle, but we do see light 2. So if I turn that on, you can see what it's doing. Again, this is an additive light, so it's just adding that brightness value and discarding the black information, and you can see that's just giving a little bit of scene illumination at the base of that lamppost, and we're getting a little bit of light. You can see there we're getting a little bit of light on the upright and on the adjacent building, and a little bit on this side, although that's problematic, and that will need to be fixed in the composite because that light would not actually get into that recess. And then we've got our main light, which is this one. That's a really important one, because down the road I'm actually going to want to apply a flicker to that. So I'm going to be dealing with this as a separate pass, and I'm actually going to be assigning a flicker to that, so that it kind of as if the light's faulty. And I'm also going to be applying some colours onto this, so that because there's no way we get this kind of brightness from Victorian lamps. They were at the very, very beginning of tungsten lighting, and their lights were very weak. And then finally we've got our town hall light. I'll just zoom out so we can see this. If I turn on the light from the town hall, this is the light that's coming from imaginary this direction, sort of casting down. It's a spotlight that I've set on an angle to kind of create these highlights on the side of this pillar and on the edge of this step, and then fall off into the square. So we can see that when I turn that on and off, we can see what that is illuminating. Then we've got our ambient occlusion, and this creates secondary shadows and places those secondary shadows into the recessed areas. So we can see that that's a really important pass. And then we've got our material ID for later on, for when we get into the composite and we want to create masks without actually going through the process of hand drawing around everything, which would be a real pain. Okay, so that is my render pass. I would create a render, a Photoshop file like this for every single one of my camera positions. And what it essentially means is that I've got a starting place to start my matte painting. I can see now how I could start to paint into this. For example, if I just put a layer into here and maybe get some kind of material, cut some kind of colour like that. Get a slightly bigger brush, and maybe put this on a soft light so that it's kind of creating some softness to this. Okay. So what I should be able to do now is I should be able to start painting into this. This is way too opaque. The brush is way too small as well. But we can see how I can start to cast some colour into this scene very, very quickly. And this is essentially going to be my approach. I'm going to be putting some base colour onto this, some flat colour, using this approach, and then I'm going to be bringing some textures in, brick textures, maybe stone textures, masonry, damaged plaster, some stone around the steps, etc. And I'm going to be actually sort of photobashing that into this scene, using the geometry, the passes there to enable me to manage the perspectives and things like that. And that's essentially how I'm going to start to build this matte painting up. Okay, so I won't do it any more than that at this stage, other than to say, and just to repeat, that I'll be creating a version of this for every single one of my camera projection passes. These are just still frames, obviously, and then I'll be using these as the basis for my painting. Now this frame is going to be where I'm going to create my primary matte painting. I'm going to basically build an entire matte painting which is going to sort of start somewhere around about this pillar and come down, and it's going to go all the way across to, in fact it will go all the way across, although I may not focus too much on this building, but I'll certainly want to try and capture the ground all the way across the frame. I'll need to get this building in the distance here, and the street furniture as well. So I'll be wanting to get all of that. So I'm actually going to create a completed matte painting from this particular camera position, albeit without the areas that I've just mentioned. And then the rest of the camera projection cameras that I've got, I'm going to be using those to create patches. So basically just sort of building on this. So I will have a separate projection which will allow me to texture just this building on the right. I'll be creating distinctive and separate projections for the ground. That's not to say I won't actually sort of create some textures over here, but they'll almost certainly be overwritten by specific textures on the ground. Yeah, and I think that's probably about enough for now. I just wanted to kind of go through this process. As much as anything, it's a good aide de memoire for myself. and yeah, there's some important little tricks here that you can take into your own projects hopefully. Anyway, that's me done.